The classroom falls silent as Professor Winters points to the impossibly complex equation on the board. Her smile is cold, calculating, a trap set for the quiet black boy who refuses to sit down in her class. "Mr. Johnson," she announces loudly, "since you think you're too special for classroom rules, perhaps you'd like to solve this graduate-level problem for us?" The students exchange nervous glances. Everyone knows Marco is just a scholarship kid from the poor side of town. What they don't know is why he stands at the back of every class, clutching his notebook like a shield. "I'll try, Professor," Marco says quietly, approaching the board. What happens next will change everything at Westridge Academy forever. Because Professor Winters has no idea she just challenged a published mathematical genius who's been hiding in plain sight. Why does this brilliant young mind conceal his extraordinary gift? What painful secret is he protecting? And what happens when the truth finally comes to light? To find out the shocking answer, watch the full story. Dear viewer, if you are watching my story for the first time, I humbly request you write the location from where you are watching right now, subscribe this channel and press the bell icon now not to miss the notifications of my daily published new stories. Thank you, and let's dive into the full story. Marco Johnson stood at the gates of Westridge Academy, his worn backpack clutched tightly against his side. The prestigious private school loomed before him, its red brick buildings and manicured lawns a stark contrast to the underfunded public school he'd attended until last month. A partial scholarship had opened this door, an opportunity his father had insisted he couldn't pass up. "It's your ticket out, son," Marcus Johnson had said, his calloused hands resting on Marco's shoulders. "A chance I never had." Marco nodded, remembering his father's words as he took his first steps onto campus. His father worked 2 jobs now to cover the remaining tuition. Failure wasn't an option. The hallways of Westridge buzzed with activity as students in pressed uniforms rushed to their first classes. Marco checked his schedule, advanced calculus with Professor Winters in room 204. He found the classroom easily enough, pausing at the threshold to take a deep breath before entering. Professor Valletta Winters stood at the whiteboard, her blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun. She was writing out a complex equation with practiced efficiency, not bothering to look up as students filtered in. Marco scanned the room, noticing all the seats were arranged in neat rows. His back tensed involuntarily. The memory of his last math class, of Ms. Porter's ruler cracking across his back when he'd corrected her formula, flashed through his mind. The physical pain had faded, but the humiliation lingered, as did the occasional sharp pain when he sat for too long. Rather than taking a seat, Marco positioned himself against the back wall, hoping to remain inconspicuous until he could speak privately with the professor about his situation. Professor Winters finally turned to face the class, her eyes narrowing as she conducted a silent roll call. Her gaze stopped when it reached Marco. "We sit in desks in this classroom," she announced, her voice carrying an edge that made several students shift uncomfortably. "Mr. Johnson, ma'am." "Marco Johnson." "Mr. Johnson. Please take a seat." Marco swallowed hard. "I'd prefer to stand, if that's all right. I have a medical. In my classroom, we follow proper protocol," Professor Winters cut him off. "Take a seat, or take yourself to the administration office." A flush of embarrassment crept up Marco's neck as whispers rippled through the classroom. He remembered his father's sacrifice and reluctantly moved toward an empty desk in the back row. As he sat, a jolt of pain shot up his spine, but he kept his expression neutral, unwilling to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing his discomfort. "Now," Professor Winters continued, "let's begin with a review of differentiation principles." Marco opened his notebook, focusing intently on the equations despite his discomfort. Numbers had always been his refuge, a world where everything made perfect sense, unlike people. He'd learned to keep his mathematical talents hidden after what happened at his last school, but as Professor Winters wrote out a particularly elegant proof, he couldn't help but feel a familiar excitement stirring within him. For a moment, he forgot about the pain in his back and the weight of being the scholarship kid. In the sea of numbers and symbols, Marco Johnson was home. The bells signaling the end of class couldn't come soon enough for Marco. He'd spent the entire period shifting uncomfortably, trying to find a position that didn't send shooting pains up his spine. The moment Professor Winters dismissed them, he was the first on his feet, relief washing over his face. "Mr. Johnson," Professor Winters called out as students filed from the room. "A word, please." Marco approached her desk cautiously, posture rigid. "I noticed you seemed fidgety during class," she said, arranging papers with meticulous precision. "Is my teaching style not engaging enough for you?" "No, ma'am. Your teaching is fine. It's just, or perhaps the material is too advanced." She looked up, her gaze clinical and assessing. "Your file indicates you transferred from Eastside Public. Their curriculum is typically 2 semesters behind ours." Marco bit back a correction. Eastside's regular curriculum was indeed behind, but he'd been in their advanced program. "I can handle the material, Professor." "Then explain your behavior," she demanded, crossing her arms over her chest. "And this odd insistence on standing." Marco shifted his weight, debating how much to reveal. "I have back pain from an incident at my previous school. Sitting for extended periods is difficult." Professor Winters' eyebrows rose slightly. "An incident? Care to elaborate?" "A teacher there believed in corporal punishment for perceived insubordination," Marco said quietly, his voice steady despite the humiliation burning in his chest. "I corrected a mistake in her calculation." For a moment, something like sympathy flickered across Professor Winters' face, but it vanished quickly. "Mr. Johnson, if you expect special accommodations, I'll need proper documentation from a physician. Until then, I expect you to follow classroom protocol like everyone else." "Yes, ma'am," Marco replied, eyes downcast. "And Marco," she added, her tone softening marginally, "if you're struggling with the material, come to my office hours. Westridge maintains certain standards, and I'd hate to see you fall behind." The assumption stung worse than his back. "I understand the material, Professor." "We'll see," she replied with a thin smile. "First quiz is Friday. It separates the truly prepared from those who merely think they are." Marco nodded and turned to leave. "One more thing," Professor Winters called after him. "If you actually understood today's lecture, perhaps you could explain why you were writing something entirely different in your notebook. I don't appreciate students not paying attention." Marco froze. She'd noticed. "I was just working through some alternative approaches to the problems," he said carefully. "Alternative approaches?" Professor Winters gave a dismissive laugh. "The methods I teach are the most efficient for this level. But I admire your confidence, misplaced though it may be." As Marco left the classroom, he could feel her eyes on him, already categorizing him, scholarship student, troublemaker, out of his depth. He tightened his grip on his notebook, the one place where his true mathematical abilities remained hidden. Inside those pages, he not only followed along with her lecture but had derived 3 different ways to solve the problems she presented, including one that was demonstrably more elegant than her approach. But Marco had learned his lesson about showing off his mathematical gift. Some teachers didn't appreciate being challenged, especially by someone who looked like him. Better to keep his head down, endure the back pain, and get through this semester without drawing attention. In the crowded hallway, a blonde student in an expensive-looking watch bumped roughly into Marco's shoulder. "Watch it, scholarship," the boy sneered. Marco said nothing, tucking his precious notebook closer to his chest as he navigated toward his next class. One day at Westridge Academy down, many more to go. The soft glow of his desk lamp illuminated Marco's bedroom as he hunched over his calculus homework. Outside, rain pattered against the window of the modest apartment he shared with his father. It was well past midnight, but Marco wasn't working on homework out of necessity. He'd finished Professor Winters' assigned problems in minutes. Now he was exploring something far more interesting, an extension of the Riemann hypothesis he'd been puzzling over for weeks. His notebook was filled with elegant scrawls of mathematical notation, formulas spreading across pages like intricate artwork. This was Marco's true self, a side he'd learned to keep hidden after what happened at Eastside. "Still at it?" His father's voice came from the doorway. Marco looked up, offering a tired smile. Just finishing up. Marcus Johnson stepped into the room, still wearing his janitor's uniform from his evening shift. Deep lines of exhaustion etched his face, but pride gleamed in his eyes as he glanced at his son's work. Though Marcus didn't understand higher mathematics, he recognized his son's gift. "Dr. Thompson called today," Marcus said, sitting on the edge of Marco's bed. "He's worried about you." Dr. James Thompson had been Marco's mentor at Eastside, the one teacher who had recognized and nurtured his extraordinary talent. After the incident with Ms. Porter, Dr. Thompson had helped secure Marco's scholarship to Westridge, hoping a fresh start would allow his abilities to flourish again. "I'm fine," Marco insisted, closing his notebook. "Westridge is different. But I'm managing." "Are you letting yourself shine, son? Dr. Thompson says your last paper on non-Euclidean geometry could have been published if you'd let him submit it under your real name instead of that pseudonym." Marco shook his head. "It's better this way, Dad. You know what happened last time." The memory hung between them, Marco, a 14-year-old freshman, correcting Ms. Porter's calculus formula in front of the entire class. Her fury, the classroom falling silent as she'd ordered him to the front, made him bend over her desk, and administered 3 sharp blows with a wooden ruler across his back, all for the crime of being right when she was wrong. The physical bruises had healed, but the public humiliation and injustice had left deeper scars. After that day, Marco had retreated into himself, doing just well enough to maintain his GPA without drawing attention. Only in Dr. Thompson's private sessions and in the sanctuary of his bedroom did he allow his true mathematical brilliance to emerge. "That teacher was wrong, Marco," his father said gently. "What she did was wrong. But you can't hide your light forever." "I'm not hiding," Marco protested. "I'm just being strategic." Marcus sighed, placing a weathered hand on his son's shoulder. "Strategy's good. But don't let fear make your decisions for you. Not everyone is like Ms. Porter." After his father left, Marco returned to his notebook, flipping back to the page where he discreetly corrected Professor Winter's work from that day's class. Her approach to the multivariable optimization problem had been textbook, solid, but inefficient. Marco had derived a more elegant solution using a dimensional reduction technique typically covered in graduate-level courses. He traced the equations with his finger, remembering the thrill of discovery, the pure joy of mathematics that had captured his heart since childhood. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine sharing these insights, seeing recognition rather than resentment in a teacher's eyes. Then he remembered Professor Winter's dismissive tone when he'd mentioned alternative approaches, and the moment passed. He closed the notebook. At school the next day, Marco again stood at the back of Professor Winter's classroom, this time with a doctor's note explaining his need to stand during class due to a previous back injury. She'd accepted it with a tight-lipped smile that suggested she still thought he was making excuses. As she lectured on integral calculus, Marco noticed a small error in her derivation of a complex formula. His hand twitched toward his pencil, old instincts urging him to note the correction. For a second, he hesitated, then carefully wrote the correct formula in his notebook, making sure no one could see. Some battles weren't worth fighting. Not yet, anyway. But as he wrote out the proper equation, a small part of him wondered how long he could keep his mathematical genius hidden, and what might happen when it inevitably came to light. 3 weeks into the semester, Westridge Academy had fallen into a predictable rhythm for Marco. He stood in the back of Professor Winter's calculus class, took meticulous notes that revealed only a fraction of his understanding, and kept to himself. The doctor's note had temporarily resolved the sitting issue, but he could feel Professor Winter's irritation growing each day as she glanced at him standing against the back wall. "Mr. Johnson," Professor Winters called out suddenly, interrupting her own lecture on Taylor series. "Since you have such a privileged vantage point, perhaps you'd like to explain why Taylor's theorem allows us to approximate functions this way." All eyes turned to Marco. It was a simple question for someone of his ability, almost insultingly so, but he recognized the trap. Show too much understanding, and he'd draw unwanted attention; show too little, and she'd use it to justify her assumptions about his capabilities. Taylor's series work because functions can be approximated by polynomials centered at a point, he answered carefully, offering just enough to seem competent but not exceptional. The derivatives determine the coefficients. Professor Winter's eyes narrowed slightly. Technically correct, if simplistic. Can anyone provide a more nuanced explanation? Chad Whitley's hand shot up. With his designer watch glinting under the fluorescent lights, he launched into an explanation that was straight from the textbook, complete with the exact phrasing Professor Winters had used in the previous class. Excellent, Mr. Whitley, she beamed. That's the level of precision I expect in this class. The message was clear: Marco's standing position wasn't the only thing that made him an outsider here. After class, as Marco gathered his books, Chad deliberately bumped into him. Scholarship kids should know their place, he muttered. Standing at the back like some kind of servant. Fitting, isn't it? Marco said nothing, years of similar encounters having taught him the futility of engagement. But as he turned to leave, a voice spoke up. Shut up, Chad, a girl with bright eyes and copper braids said, stepping between them. Your daddy's donations can't buy you brain cells. Chad's face reddened. Stay out of this, Tanya. No one asked for your opinion. And no one asked for your existence, yet here we are, Tanya retorted, grabbing her backpack. She turned to Marco. Come on, the air quality improves dramatically once you're away from trust fund babies. Stunned, Marco followed her into the hallway. Tanya Williams, she introduced herself once they were clear of the classroom. You're the new scholarship kid who's got Winters all worked up. I don't want trouble, Marco said cautiously. Too late, Tanya grinned. Existing while smart and black in Westridge Academy is all the trouble you need. I should know. She gestured to herself. Third-year scholarship student here. The only difference is I stopped caring what they think freshman year. For the first time since arriving at Westridge, Marco felt something loosen in his chest, the possibility of an ally. Why does Professor Winters hate me standing? It's not disrupting anything. Tanya laughed. Winters is all about control. You've got that doctor's note, so she can't force you to sit, but your standing reminds her daily that she couldn't bend you to her will. For control freaks like her, that's unforgivable. As they walked, Tanya explained the unwritten social hierarchy of Westridge, the legacy students at the top, the wealthy international students next, followed by the full-paying newcomers, with scholarship students firmly at the bottom. It's not official policy, of course, she added. But you'll feel it everywhere. Some teachers fight against it, like Mrs. Rodriguez in physics. Others, like Winters, might as well have it printed on their syllabus. So what do I do? Marco asked. Tanya studied him for a moment. That depends. Are you here just to survive and get a diploma, or are you here to change things? The question hung between them as they reached the cafeteria doors. Through the windows, Marco could see the subtle segregation Tanya had described, wealthy students clustered at central tables, scholarship kids relegated to the periphery. I'm just trying to make it through, he said finally, the weight of his father's sacrifice and his own painful history pressing down on him. I can't afford complications. Fair enough, Tanya nodded, though disappointment flashed briefly in her eyes. But just so you know, Winters is going to make a move soon. She can't stand unresolved challenges to her authority. Be ready. As if summoned by their conversation, Professor Winters appeared at the end of the hallway, her gaze locking with Marco's. Something in her expression, a mixture of determination and disdain, sent a chill down his spine. Tanya was right. A confrontation was coming, whether he wanted it or not. The classroom fell silent as Professor Winters strode in, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. Her usual neat appearance was slightly disheveled today, hair pulled back more severely than usual, a coffee stain barely visible on her sleeve. She dropped a heavy stack of papers onto her desk with a resonant thud. Pop quiz, she announced, her voice cutting through the collective groan. Clear your desks except for a pencil. Students scrambled to comply, but Professor Winters held up her hand. Actually, before we begin, I think we need a demonstration. Her eyes locked onto Marco, who stood in his usual place against the back wall. "Mr. Johnson, please come to the board." Murmurs rippled through the classroom as Marco slowly made his way forward. 5 weeks of simmering tension between them had led to this moment, he could feel it. "Since you have a medical exemption from classroom seating," Professor Winters said, her voice dripping with skepticism, "perhaps you'd be more comfortable working at the board anyway." She handed him a marker, then turned to retrieve something from her desk, a textbook, but not their usual one. It was thicker, with a University Press logo on the spine. Advanced Theoretical Calculus was embossed in gold lettering. "This problem," she said, flipping to a dog-eared page, "is from the graduate-level curriculum at MIT. I've been curious about your alternative approaches." The last 2 words were spoken with unmistakable mockery, referencing their conversation from weeks ago. "Show us how you'd solve this." She wrote out a complex differential equation on the board, a partial differential equation with multiple variables and boundary conditions that would challenge most college seniors. The classroom fell utterly silent. Even Chad stopped his usual snickering, leaning forward to see how this public execution would unfold. Marco stared at the equation, immediately recognizing it as a variation of the heat equation with non-standard boundary conditions. His mind rapidly cycled through potential solution methods, separation of variables, Fourier transforms, Green's functions. For a moment, the old fear gripped him, the memory of Ms. Porter's ruler, the humiliation. But then he caught Tanya's eye from the 3rd row. She gave him the smallest nod of encouragement. "Any day now, Mr. Johnson," Professor Winters said, leaning against her desk with arms crossed. "Or is this beyond your capabilities? No shame in admitting when you're out of your depth." Marco took a deep breath. In that moment, he made a decision. Not a dramatic one, he wouldn't reveal the full extent of his abilities. But he wouldn't play dumb either. He began writing, using a standard approach to the heat equation, methodically working through the separation of variables. His handwriting was neat, his steps logical and clear. He could feel Professor Winters' surprise as he continued without hesitation, working through complex manipulations with confidence. "This is taking too long," Professor Winters interrupted after a few minutes, clearly unsettled by his progress. "Let's move on to the quiz." "I'm almost finished," Marco said quietly, continuing to write. The class watched in stunned silence as he completed the solution, double-checked his work, and capped the marker. Professor Winters approached the board slowly, her eyes scanning his work. She frowned, checked the textbook, then looked back at the board. "This is correct," she admitted reluctantly. "Though a rather elementary approach. Would you prefer I use the Fourier transform method? Or perhaps Green's functions?" Marco asked, his voice steady despite his pounding heart. "Those would be more elegant for this particular problem." The classroom erupted in whispers. Professor Winters' face flushed slightly as she closed the graduate textbook with a snap. "That won't be necessary. Return to your place, Mr. Johnson. Class, begin your quizzes." As Marco walked back to his spot, he caught Tanya giving him a subtle thumbs up. The fear still lingered in his chest, but alongside it was something new, a small spark of vindication, and perhaps, the courage to stop hiding. The following day, tension crackled in the air as students filed into calculus class. Word of Marco's performance had spread through Westridge Academy like wildfire. As he took his usual position at the back wall, whispers followed him: "Math genius, scholarship prodigy," and "Did you see Winters' face?" Professor Valletta Winters entered precisely as the bell rang, her expression unreadable. She placed her materials on the desk with deliberate care, then turned to face the class. "Before we begin today's lesson, I'd like to address yesterday's demonstration." Her gaze fixed on Marco. "Mr. Johnson solved a university-level problem correctly, which is commendable. However, I have concerns about how he acquired this knowledge." Marco felt his chest tighten. Here it came, the accusation, the assumption that someone like him couldn't possibly have legitimate mathematical skills. The solution Mr. Johnson provided matches, almost exactly, an example from Kressner's Advanced Differential Equations, page 342. Professor Winters pulled out another textbook and held it up. The similarity is striking enough to raise questions about academic integrity. The room fell silent. Marco's ears burned as classmates turned to stare at him. Even Tanya looked uncertain. "I've never seen that book," Marco said quietly. "Really? Then perhaps you'd care to explain how you solved a graduate-level problem with such convenience." Professor Winters challenged, approaching him. Marco took a deep breath. "That problem is a modified heat equation. There are only so many standard approaches to solve it. I used separation of variables because it's the most straightforward method for the boundary conditions you provided. And your knowledge of Fourier transforms and Green's functions? Those are hardly covered in high school curricula, even at Westridge." "I study independently," Marco replied, his voice gaining strength. "Mathematics doesn't begin and end with classroom instruction, Professor." Chad scoffed loudly. "Yeah, right. He probably has the answers hidden in that notebook he's always scribbling in." Professor Winters' eyes narrowed. "Your notebook, Mr. Johnson. May I see it?" The request sent a jolt of panic through Marco. His notebook contained not just his class notes but his original research, his corrections to Professor Winters' occasional errors, and mathematical explorations far beyond high school level. It was his private sanctuary. "My notebook is personal property," he said, clutching it closer. "In my classroom, I have the right to inspect materials if I suspect academic dishonesty," Professor Winters countered, hand extended. "The notebook, please." For a moment, Marco considered refusing outright. But the stakes were too high: his scholarship, his father's sacrifices, his future. Reluctantly, he handed over the notebook. The classroom watched in tense silence as Professor Winters flipped through the pages. Her expression shifted from smug certainty to confusion, then disbelief. Page after page of advanced mathematical notation, original proofs, and complex calculations, far beyond what she'd expected to find. She stopped at a page dated 3 weeks earlier, the day she'd made a small error in her explanation of multivariable limits. There in the margin, Marco had not only noted the correct formula but had derived it using 3 different methods, adding a note: "Professor's approach works for most cases but fails when approaching from polar coordinates." "What is this?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. "My notes," Marco answered simply. Professor Winters continued flipping, finding page after page of similar corrections, extensions, and original mathematical explorations. Near the back, she found a half-completed proof with a reference citation: "Extension of Johnson's Approach to Non-Euclidean Manifolds, Journal of Mathematical Analysis, Volume 42. "Johnson?" She looked up sharply. "As in?" "M. J. Johnson is my pseudonym," Marco admitted, aware that the entire class was witnessing his unmasking. "Dr. Thompson at Eastside helped me publish a few papers. We used initials to avoid complications." "Complications?" Professor Winters repeated faintly. "Not everyone is comfortable with the idea that a black teenager from a public school might have mathematical insights worth publishing," Marco said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "The last teacher who discovered my abilities had me beaten for showing off. So yes, Professor Winters, I've learned to be careful about what I reveal." A stunned silence fell over the classroom. Professor Winters stared at the notebook, then at Marco, her worldview visibly rearranging itself before the entire class. "These derivations," she finally said, pointing to one page. "They're original?" "Yes." "And this approach to the Taylor series convergence problem?" "I was exploring an alternative proof. It's not complete yet." Professor Winters closed the notebook slowly. For the first time since Marco had met her, she seemed at a loss for words. The carefully constructed narrative she built about him, the presumption of mediocrity, the assumption of dishonesty, had crumbled in her hands. "I believe," she said finally, returning the notebook to Marco, "we need to have a conversation about appropriate placement for your mathematical education, Mr. Johnson." She turned to the class. "Open your textbooks to page 217. Begin reading while I step out with Mr. Johnson." As Marco followed Professor Winters into the hallway, he caught Tanya's wide-eyed glance. Something had fundamentally changed. His carefully constructed anonymity was gone, for better or worse. In its place was something unexpected, the truth, finally revealed. The next morning, Marco found himself summoned to Dean Howard's office. The administrative wing of Westridge Academy exuded old money and tradition, oak-paneled walls lined with portraits of distinguished alumni, thick carpeting that muffled footsteps, and a perpetual scent of lemon polish and old books. As he approached the secretary's desk, Marco spotted Professor Winters already seated in the waiting area, her posture rigid, a folder clutched tightly in her hands. She glanced up as he entered but quickly looked away, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Johnson," the secretary nodded. "The dean will see you both now." Dean Howard was a tall man with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone who had never questioned his place in the world. He gestured for them to sit in the leather chairs facing his imposing desk. "I've heard quite a story from Professor Winters," the dean began, steepling his fingers. "Something about published papers and mathematical prodigies standing in the back of classrooms." His tone made it clear he found the situation more of an inconvenience than a discovery. "I've brought verification," Professor Winters said, opening her folder and placing several printed journal articles on the desk. "These were published under M. J. Johnson. The mathematical style matches perfectly with what I found in Marco's notebook." Dean Howard glanced at the papers without touching them. "And why is this being brought to my attention, exactly?" "Because we have an extraordinary student whose needs aren't being met by our current curriculum," Professor Winters replied, a hint of defiance in her voice that surprised Marco. "Westridge prides itself on academic excellence, yet we've failed to recognize a mathematical talent of significant caliber." The dean's expression remained impassive. "Let me be frank. Westridge Academy maintains certain standards and procedures. We don't typically restructure our academic programs for individual students, regardless of their abilities." He turned to Marco. "Your scholarship is contingent on maintaining a 3.5 GPA in our standard curriculum. There was no provision for special accommodations." "I'm not asking for special treatment," Marco said quietly. "Just the opportunity to learn at a level that challenges me." "The issue, Dean Howard," Professor Winters interjected, "isn't just about Marco's education. It's about Westridge's reputation. Do we want to be known as the school that failed to nurture a mathematical prodigy, or the institution that helped launch his career?" Marco glanced at Professor Winters, surprised by her sudden advocacy. Just days ago, she had been determined to expose him as a fraud, now she seemed equally determined to champion his cause. Dean Howard leaned back in his chair, considering. "Our mathematics department isn't equipped for individual instruction at a graduate level. And the budget." "I've already spoken with Dr. Reynolds at the university," Professor Winters interrupted. "He's willing to provide materials and mentorship. All we need is administrative approval for an independent study course and perhaps some schedule adjustments." "And what about the other scholarship students?" Dean Howard challenged. "If we make exceptions for Mr. Johnson, where does it end?" "With all due respect," Marco found himself saying, his voice stronger than he intended, "if other scholarship students demonstrate similar capabilities in their fields, shouldn't Westridge be proud to support them too?" A heavy silence followed his words. Dean Howard studied Marco with newfound intensity. "You know," the dean said finally, "your situation reminds me of another student we had years ago. Brilliant pianist, scholarship kid from the East Side. We made no accommodations." He paused, a flicker of something like regret crossing his features. "He dropped out after a semester. Now he's at Juilliard, and every article about him mentions how Westridge failed to recognize his talent." Professor Winters leaned forward. "History doesn't need to repeat itself." Dean Howard sighed, reaching for a form in his desk drawer. "I'll approve an independent study course for the remainder of the semester. Professor Winters will oversee it, coordinating with Dr. Reynolds as needed." He fixed Marco with a stern look. "But your other coursework cannot suffer, Mr. Johnson. Excellence is not selective at Westridge." "I understand," Marco nodded, a mixture of relief and trepidation washing over him. As they left the office, Professor Winters turned to Marco, her usual confidence replaced by an awkward hesitancy. "I owe you an apology, Mr. Johnson," she said finally. "I made assumptions based on, well, factors that had nothing to do with your mathematical ability." Marco studied her, trying to gauge her sincerity. "Why the sudden change? Yesterday you were accusing me of cheating." Professor Winters flinched slightly at his directness. "Because I was wrong," she admitted. "And in mathematics, when a hypothesis is disproven, we must discard it and formulate a better one." She paused. "I've spent my career fighting to be taken seriously as a female mathematician. I should have recognized the same struggle in you, just manifesting differently." It wasn't a complete answer, but it was honest. Marco nodded, not quite ready to forgive but willing to move forward. "So what happens now?" he asked. "Now," Professor Winters said, some of her usual confidence returning, "we see just how far your mathematical talent can really go." That afternoon, Professor Winters sat alone in her office, surrounded by stacks of mathematical journals. Since discovering Marco's true abilities, she had spent every free moment researching M.J. Johnson's published works, tracing the development of his mathematical thinking through academic publications dating back 3 years. She'd expected to find youthful enthusiasm, perhaps some promising ideas. What she discovered instead left her breathless: original approaches to long-standing problems, elegant proofs that simplified complex concepts, and innovative applications that mathematicians twice his age hadn't considered. And she had almost crushed it all with her prejudice and assumptions. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, hastily organizing the scattered papers. Mrs. Rodriguez, the physics teacher, entered with a knowing smile. "I hear you finally discovered what I've suspected since the first week of classes." "You knew?" Professor Winters asked incredulously. "Not specifically, no. But I recognize the signs: a student who deliberately underperforms, who seems to be hiding something." Mrs. Rodriguez sat in the chair across from Winters. "In my classroom, Marco occasionally slips, solves problems too quickly or approaches them in ways beyond the curriculum. When I asked him about it privately, he became evasive." Professor Winters sighed, rubbing her temples. "I've been teaching for 15 years, Elena. How did I miss this so completely?" "Perhaps because you weren't looking for brilliance in a student who stands at the back of your class," Mrs. Rodriguez suggested gently. "We all have our blind spots, Valletta." The comment stung, but Winters couldn't deny its truth. She had categorized Marco from day one: another scholarship student, probably underprepared, definitely troublesome with his insistence on standing. She had never once considered that his mathematical abilities might exceed her own. "I need to understand what happened at his previous school," she said, tapping a note in her research. "These papers are co-authored with a Dr. James Thompson from Eastside Public. The last publication was 9 months ago, then nothing, which coincides with Marco's transfer to Westridge." "Be careful, Valletta," Mrs. Rodriguez warned. "If the boy doesn't volunteer his past, there may be good reason." "I know," Professor Winters nodded. "But if I'm going to help him properly, I need the full picture." After Mrs. Rodriguez left, Professor Winters located Dr. Thompson's contact information from Eastside Public's faculty directory. Her finger hovered over the call button for a moment. Was she overstepping? But her academic responsibility won out. If Marco truly was the mathematical talent his publication suggested, she had an obligation to nurture that gift properly. Dr. Thompson answered on the third ring. "Mathematics Department, Dr. Thompson speaking." "Dr. Thompson, this is Professor Valletta Winters from Westridge Academy. I'm calling regarding a former student of yours, Marco Johnson." A pause. "Is Marco all right?" The concern in his voice was immediate and genuine. "He's fine," she assured him. "In fact, I've recently discovered his extraordinary mathematical abilities. I found his publications under M.J. Johnson." "Ah." The single syllable conveyed volumes. "And I presume you're calling to verify these abilities?" "Partly," Professor Winters admitted. but mostly to understand how to best support him. His work is remarkable, yet he went to great lengths to hide it. I need to understand why. Another pause, longer this time. Professor Winters, may I speak candidly? Please. Marco Johnson is the most brilliant mathematical mind I've encountered in 30 years of teaching. His intuitive grasp of abstract concepts, his ability to see connections that elude seasoned mathematicians, it's extraordinarily rare. Pride swelled unexpectedly in Professor Winters' chest, as though Marco's gifts somehow reflected on her, despite her having done nothing to foster them. Then why hide it? She pressed. Why publish under initials? Why transfer schools? Dr. Thompson sighed heavily. That's Marco's story to tell. But I will say this, brilliance like his can be threatening to those whose authority depends on being the smartest person in the room. The words hit uncomfortably close to home. Hadn't she felt threatened when she suspected Marco might understand the material better than she expected? Hadn't she immediately jumped to accusations of cheating rather than considering his ability? There was an incident, Dr. Thompson continued carefully. A teacher here who responded inappropriately when Marco corrected a mathematical error. It left him with both physical and psychological scars. Professor Winters felt sick as she recalled Marco's explanation for standing, a previous back injury, from an incident where he'd corrected a teacher's calculation. This teacher, what happened to them? She asked, gripping the phone tightly. Administrative leave, eventually terminated. But the damage was done. Marco withdrew into himself, began hiding his abilities. I tried to provide an outlet through our research together, but after the incident became public knowledge, the environment here became untenable for him. So he transferred to Westridge, Professor Winters concluded. Yes. I helped secure his scholarship, hoping a fresh start would allow him to rebuild his confidence. Dr. Thompson's voice took on a sharper edge. I had hoped Westridge, with its prestigious reputation, would recognize his gifts sooner than this. The rebuke was gentle but unmistakable. Professor Winters swallowed her pride. I'm trying to make it right, she said. We're establishing an independent study program for him, with university-level resources. That's a start, Dr. Thompson acknowledged. But what Marco needs most isn't advanced coursework, he can find that on his own. What he needs is to feel safe being brilliant. To know that his mind is a gift, not a liability. As the conversation ended, Professor Winters sat back in her chair, Dr. Thompson's words echoing in her mind. She looked at the stack of Marco's published papers, then at her own reflection in the darkened computer screen. The face that looked back at her was not one she particularly liked at that moment. She had prided herself on being an advocate for mathematical excellence, yet had been blind to extraordinary talent standing right in her classroom, all because it came in a package she hadn't bothered to unwrap. Tomorrow, she decided, things would change. Not just for Marco, but for herself as well. The university library was nearly empty on Saturday morning, making it the perfect place for the meeting Professor Winters had arranged. Marco arrived precisely on time, his ever-present notebook tucked under his arm, his expression guarded. Thank you for coming, Professor Winters said, gesturing to the chair across from her. I know weekends are precious. You said it was important, Marco replied, sitting carefully. The large study table between them was spread with familiar papers, his publications, annotated extensively in Professor Winters' neat handwriting. I spoke with Dr. Thompson, she began, watching Marco's face closely. A flash of surprise, quickly masked. He thinks very highly of you. Dr. Thompson is a good teacher, Marco said cautiously. He's more than that to you, though, isn't he? A mentor. A protector, perhaps. Professor Winters leaned forward. He told me there was an incident at Eastside, but not the details. I think I need to understand what happened if I'm going to help you properly. Marco's fingers tightened around his notebook. With all due respect, Professor, why does my past matter? I'm doing the work you assign. I've agreed to the independent study program. Because, Professor Winters said carefully, I don't want to make the same mistakes your previous teacher made. And without knowing what those mistakes were, I might inadvertently repeat them. For a long moment, Marco studied her, as if calculating complex variables in his head: trust, risk, potential benefit, potential harm. Finally, he exhaled slowly. "It was my freshman year at Eastside," he began, his voice steady despite the difficulty of the subject. "Ms. Porter's Algebra 2 class. She was explaining quadratic functions, but her explanation of the discriminant was flawed. When I raised my hand and pointed out the error, she dismissed me. When I persisted and showed the correct formula, she became angry." Professor Winters nodded encouragingly, though dread was building in her chest. "After class, she had me stay behind. Said I was being insubordinate, trying to undermine her authority. She made me bend over her desk and struck me 3 times with a wooden ruler." Marco's voice remained clinical, detached, as if describing a mathematical proof rather than a traumatic experience. It wasn't just the physical pain. It was the message: being right was wrong. Being smart was dangerous. "That's assault," Professor Winters said, unable to contain her outrage. "She should have been fired immediately." She was, eventually. But not before rumors spread that I was a troublemaker who challenged a teacher. Some students thought I deserved what happened. Some teachers became wary of me, afraid I might point out their mistakes too. Marco's gaze dropped to his notebook. Dr. Thompson was different. He saw what was happening and reached out. Gave me advanced materials, worked with me after school, eventually helped me publish my first paper under initials to protect my identity. "And then you transferred to Westridge," Professor Winters concluded. Dr. Thompson thought a fresh start would help. A place where nobody knew me as the kid who got beaten for being too smart. A bitter smile touched Marco's lips. "So I learned to be invisible. To do just well enough without drawing attention. To stand in the back, literally and figuratively." The realization of her own role in reinforcing his trauma hit Professor Winters like a physical blow. Her dismissal of his medical excuse, her public challenging of his abilities, her accusation of cheating, all echoes of what he'd experienced before. "Marco, I owe you a genuine apology," she said, her voice thick with regret. "Not just for doubting your abilities, but for contributing to an environment where you felt you needed to hide them." He looked up, surprised by her candor. "When you first came to my class, I saw what I expected to see, a scholarship student who might struggle with our curriculum. I never considered the possibility that you might be light years beyond it." Professor Winters shook her head. "That failure of imagination is on me, not you." "Why are you telling me this?" Marco asked, genuine confusion in his voice. "Because you deserve to know that your past experiences weren't your fault, and neither was my response to you these past weeks." She gestured to his publication spread across the table. "Your work is extraordinary, Marco. It deserves to be developed, celebrated. Not hidden away out of fear." For the first time since she'd known him, Marco's carefully maintained facade cracked slightly. "I don't know how to be both things," he admitted quietly. "The person who stands in the back trying not to be noticed, and the mathematician these papers suggest I could be." "Perhaps you don't have to be both anymore," Professor Winters suggested gently. "Dr. Thompson mentioned that what you need most isn't advanced coursework, it's safety. The security of knowing that your intelligence is valued, not threatened. And you think Westridge can provide that?" Skepticism edged his voice. "I think I can," Professor Winters replied firmly. "I can't change the whole institution overnight, but I can change how things work in my classroom and in your independent study." She pulled a folder from her bag. "This is my proposal for your customized curriculum. But before we discuss it, I want your word on something." "What's that?" "That you'll correct me when I'm wrong," she said, smiling slightly. "Mathematically, pedagogically, or in my assumptions. I need to know you'll challenge me when necessary." Marco's eyes widened, then narrowed suspiciously. "Even in front of the class?" "Especially then. What better way to demonstrate that intellectual growth comes from recognizing and correcting errors?" She extended her hand across the table. "Do we have a deal, Mr. Johnson?" After a moment's hesitation, Marco reached out and shook her hand. It might take some getting used to, he warned. For both of us, Professor Winters agreed. Now, let's discuss your real potential and how Westridge can finally start living up to its promise of academic excellence, by actually recognizing excellence when it's standing right in front of us. For the first time since arriving at Westridge Academy, Marco opened his notebook willingly in front of a teacher, revealing pages of original mathematical explorations he'd been working on in secret. And for the first time in her teaching career, Professor Winters found herself in the unfamiliar but exhilarating position of being the student rather than the master. The truth had finally emerged, painful, complicated, but ultimately liberating for them both. Monday morning brought an unexpected development that sent ripples through Westridge Academy. As students filed into calculus class, they found the room rearranged, desks now formed a semicircle, and at the back wall where Marco usually stood, a tall drafting table had been placed, complete with an ergonomic stool that could be used for partial support without fully sitting. Professor Winters stood at the center of the semicircle, watching students' reactions with barely concealed amusement. When Marco entered, she gestured toward the drafting table. "Mr. Johnson, I believe you'll find that arrangement more suitable for your back condition while still allowing full participation in class discussions." Marco approached the table cautiously, testing the stool's height and finding it perfectly adjusted to allow him to lean without putting pressure on his injury. The drafting surface was angled for easy writing, and a small placard on the corner read simply, "Innovation requires accommodation." "Thank you," he said quietly, genuinely touched by the gesture. Professor Winters nodded, then addressed the class. "Today marks a new approach in our calculus curriculum. We'll be exploring multiple solution methodologies for each concept, recognizing that mathematics isn't about memorizing one correct procedure, but understanding the underlying principles that allow for diverse approaches." Chad Whitley's hand shot up. "Is this going to be on the exam? Because the textbook only shows one method." "An excellent question, Mr. Whitley," Professor Winters replied. "Yes, you'll be responsible for understanding multiple approaches, and more importantly, for recognizing which approach is most elegant for a given problem." As she began the lecture, Marco noticed a fundamental shift in her teaching style. Rather than presenting formulas as established facts to be memorized, she posed questions, invited alternative perspectives, and, most surprisingly, openly acknowledged the limitations of certain textbook methods. "This standard approach works perfectly well for polynomials," she explained, writing out a familiar algorithm, but becomes cumbersome for more complex functions. "Mr. Johnson, would you care to demonstrate your alternative method from last week's independent study session?" All eyes turned to Marco. For a moment, the old fear flickered, but it was quickly replaced by something new, recognition. Not just of his intelligence, but of his right to contribute. He nodded, leaving his drafting table to take the marker Professor Winters offered. At the board, he began explaining a dimensional analysis technique that simplified the problem considerably. To his surprise, hands began raising around the room, not to challenge him, but to ask genuine questions about his approach. As the class engaged with his explanation, Marco caught Professor Winters watching him with unmistakable pride. Not the pride of a teacher taking credit for a student's brilliance, but the pride of someone witnessing potential finally being realized. The class ended with more student discussion than any previous session. As they packed up, Tanya approached Marco's drafting table. "So," she grinned, "the rumors are true. You've been holding out on us, math genius." Marco smiled sheepishly. "Old habits." "Well, I like the new Marco better," she declared. "Though I have to ask, what changed with Winters? Last week she was public enemy number one, today she's your biggest fan." Before he could answer, Dean Howard appeared at the classroom door, his expression grave. "Professor Winters, Mr. Johnson, my office, immediately." The dean's office felt significantly colder than during their previous visit. Dean Howard sat rigidly behind his desk, a folder open before him. "I've received a concerning communication from the board," he began without preamble. "It seems that Mr. Whitley's father, a significant donor, as you know, has expressed displeasure about recent developments in the calculus curriculum." Professor Winters stiffened. "The curriculum adjustments are pedagogically sound and benefiting all students," not just Mr. Johnson. Nevertheless, Dean Howard continued, there are concerns about preferential treatment. The special accommodations, the accelerated independent study, the classroom modifications. He turned to Marco. And questions about whether certain scholarship requirements are being circumvented. That's absurd, Professor Winters retorted. Marco's academic performance exceeds all scholarship requirements. Perhaps, the dean conceded, but the board is concerned about precedent. If we make such extensive accommodations for one scholarship student, others might expect similar treatment. Heaven forbid we actually educate students according to their abilities, Professor Winters muttered. Dean Howard's expression hardened. There's also the matter of the Northeastern Mathematics competition next month. Traditionally, Westridge sends our top calculus student, which has been a Whitley for 3 consecutive years. Marco finally understood where this was heading. And now you're worried I might qualify instead. Chad Whitley has been preparing for this competition since freshman year, Dean Howard replied. His father's expectations are significant. So what exactly are you asking? Professor Winters pressed. Dean Howard closed the folder deliberately. The board suggests that the independent study program be scaled back to twice weekly rather than daily, that classroom modifications be removed as they create an appearance of favoritism, and that Mr. Johnson focus on the standard curriculum rather than advanced topics. He paused. They also feel it would be appropriate for Mr. Johnson to voluntarily withdraw from competition consideration this year, as a first-year student unfamiliar with Westridge traditions. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. After everything, the revelation of his abilities, Professor Winters' change of heart, the progress they'd made, Marco was still being asked to make himself smaller, to dim his light for the comfort of others. Anger flashed across Professor Winters' face. This is academically indefensible. The board has no right to interfere with curriculum decisions based on a donor's wounded pride. The board has every right to ensure that Westridge maintains its standards and traditions, Dean Howard countered. Mr. Whitley Sr. donates $500,000 annually to this institution. And what is the price tag on mathematical brilliance? Professor Winters shot back. How many millions would make it acceptable for Marco to receive appropriate educational support? Dean Howard's jaw tightened. That's quite enough, Professor Winters. These suggestions are reasonable compromises. They're not suggestions or compromises, Marco interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. They're the same message I received when a ruler was taken to my back, stay in your place. The dean had the grace to look uncomfortable. That's an unfair characterization, is it? Marco continued, surprising himself with his own boldness. You discovered I'm a published mathematician whose work appears in professional journals. Instead of celebrating that fact, which would certainly enhance Westridge's academic reputation, you're asking me to hide it because it might upset a donor's son. The situation is more nuanced than that, Dean Howard insisted. Actually, it's quite simple, Professor Winters said, standing. Either Westridge Academy values genuine academic excellence, or it values the appearance of excellence that can be bought. It cannot claim to value both equally. She turned to Marco. Mr. Johnson, I believe we have a calculus curriculum to revise. Dean Howard, when the board has decided whether it wants a school or an exclusive club, you know where to find us. As they left the office, Marco felt a strange lightness in his chest. For the first time since the incident at Eastside, someone with authority had stood up for his right to be exceptional, had confronted power on his behalf rather than wielding it against him. You didn't have to do that, he said as they walked down the hallway. You could lose your job. Professor Winters smiled grimly. Some principles are worth risking a position for, Marco. The integrity of education is one of them. She paused. Besides, tenured professors are harder to dismiss than you might think. What happens now? Marco asked. Now, Professor Winters replied, we prepare you for that mathematics competition. If they want to stop you, they'll have to do it openly, not through backroom suggestions and implied threats. As they turned the corner, they nearly collided with Chad Whitley, who had clearly been listening to their conversation. For once, his usual smug expression was absent, replaced by something closer to confusion. "Is it true?" he demanded, looking directly at Marco. "You've actually been published in math journals?" Marco hesitated, then nodded. "Why didn't you just say so?" Chad asked, genuine bewilderment in his voice. "Why stand in the back and act like you didn't belong here?" The question caught Marco off guard, not because it was difficult to answer, but because it came from such an unexpected source. Before he could respond, Professor Winters stepped in. "Perhaps, Mr. Whitley, because Marco has learned that belonging somewhere often depends less on one's abilities and more on others' willingness to make space." She fixed Chad with a pointed look. "Food for thought, wouldn't you say?" As Chad walked away, looking uncharacteristically thoughtful, Marco realized that the confrontation he'd feared for so long, being seen for who he truly was, had finally happened. And while the outcome remained uncertain, for the first time he felt ready to face whatever came next without hiding. The truth, once fully emerged, could not be unseen, by Professor Winters, by Dean Howard, or even by Chad Whitley. And in that irreversible visibility lay both risk and remarkable freedom. The Northeastern Mathematics Competition was held in the Grand Ballroom of the Marriott Hotel, transformed for the occasion into an academic battleground. Teams from 50 prestigious schools across 6 states gathered, their uniforms creating a sea of distinct colors and crests. Westridge Academy's delegation consisted of 5 students: Chad Whitley, who had won the previous year's individual competition, Tanya Williams, who had qualified through exceptional quiz scores, 2 seniors from the Advanced Placement Program, and Marco Johnson, whose inclusion had caused a near rebellion among certain board members. In the end, Professor Winters had prevailed by simply presenting Marco's qualifying exam results, which had broken school records. Even Dean Howard couldn't justify excluding him after that, though he'd taken Professor Winters aside to remind her that traditions and donor relationships must be respected. Now, as they waited for the competition to begin, tension hung in the air. Chad had barely spoken to Marco during the 3-week preparation period, though his outright hostility had mellowed to something more like wary observation. Tanya had become Marco's unofficial cheerleader, while Professor Winters had worked tirelessly to prepare him for the competition format, which differed significantly from his experience with mathematical research. "Nervous?" Tanya asked, nudging Marco's arm as they took their seats. "A little," he admitted. "I'm not used to timed problems." "You'll be fine," she assured him. "Just remember what Winters said, read each question completely before starting, manage your time, and don't get stuck on any single problem." The competition moderator, a distinguished mathematician from MIT, approached the microphone. "Welcome to the 37th Annual Northeastern Mathematics Competition. Today's event will consist of 3 rounds, individual problem solving, team collaboration, and the lightning round for our top 10 individual scorers." He smiled. "This year, we're honored to have Dr. Eliza Chen, Fields Medal recipient, who has prepared our final challenge problem." A murmur swept through the room. The Fields Medal was mathematics' highest honor, equivalent to a Nobel Prize. Dr. Chen, a small woman with an intense gaze, nodded acknowledgement from her seat among the judges. "The individual round begins in 5 minutes, the moderator concluded. Please take your assigned seats." As students moved to their designated places, Professor Winters caught Marco's eye and gave him a reassuring nod. "Remember," she said quietly, "you belong here." The first round consisted of 20 problems ranging from challenging calculus to discrete mathematics and number theory. Marco found himself settling into a comfortable rhythm, his pencil moving steadily across the paper. The timed environment was new, but the mathematics itself was a language he spoke fluently. When the buzzer sounded ending the round, Marco had completed all 20 problems with 10 minutes to spare, time he'd used to double-check his solutions. Around him, other students were frantically scribbling final answers or looking dejected at incomplete attempts. "How'd it go?" Tanya whispered as they regrouped for the team round. "Good, I think." "You finished 18, guessed on the last 2, she grinned. "Chad looks like he swallowed something sour, though." Indeed, Chad Whitley's usual confidence had given way to a tense, tight-lipped expression as he joined the Westridge team table. The team round revealed an unexpected dynamic. Despite his earlier attitude, Chad immediately took charge, assigning problems based on each person's strengths. To Marco's surprise, Chad assigned him the most difficult proofs without hesitation. "You're published," he said simply when Marco questioned the distribution. "I'm competitive, not stupid." Working together, the Westridge team finished with the second fastest time, behind only Phillips Exeter Academy. As they waited for scoring to complete, Chad approached Marco. "Look," he said awkwardly, "my father's been calling Dean Howard about you. I want you to know that wasn't my idea." Marco studied him, searching for insincerity but finding none. "Thanks for saying that. The thing is," Chad continued, lowering his voice, "I've always been the math guy at Westridge. It's kind of my whole identity. Then you show up and you're not just good, you're published in journals good." He shrugged. "It's been an adjustment." Before Marco could respond, the moderator returned to the microphone. "We have results from the first 2 rounds. The following students have qualified for the lightning round." Names were called in alphabetical order. Whitley, Chad. Westridge Academy. Chad nodded, having expected this outcome. Then, Williams, Tanya. Westridge Academy. Tanya pumped her fist in excitement. The moderator reached the end of his list. And finally, with the highest combined score from rounds 1 and 2, Johnson, Marco. Westridge Academy. A surge of whispers swept through the ballroom. 3 students from the same school in the final round was unprecedented. Professor Winters beamed from her seat among the coaches, while Dean Howard, who had arrived late, looked simultaneously proud and concerned. The lightning round lived up to its name. 10 rapid-fire problems, each more difficult than the last, with only 30 seconds allowed per question. By the 8th problem, only 4 students remained in contention: Chad, Tanya, Marco, and a girl from Phillips Exeter. Then came problem 9, a complex integration requiring an obscure substitution technique. Chad faltered, Tanya guessed incorrectly, and the Exeter student got it half right. Marco not only solved it but noted an alternative approach in the margin. "The final problem," announced the moderator, "has been prepared by Dr. Chen specifically for this competition. It involves a novel application of calculus to topology that has not been fully explored in current literature." As the problem appeared on the screen, a hush fell over the audience. It was immediately clear that this was no ordinary competition question, it was research-level mathematics, presented as a challenge to the brightest young minds in the Northeast. Marco stared at the problem, feeling a familiar excitement building. This wasn't just about remembering formulas or applying standard techniques. This required true mathematical creativity, the ability to make conceptual leaps between seemingly unrelated areas. As the 30-second timer began, Marco's pencil flew across the paper. He wasn't aware of the other competitors, or the audience, or even Professor Winters watching with bated breath. He was entirely in the mathematics, seeing connections and possibilities unfold with crystalline clarity. When time was called, he placed his pencil down, surprised to find his hand trembling slightly. The Exeter student had written nothing. Tanya had made a valiant attempt at the first step. Chad had outlined an approach but couldn't complete it. Dr. Chen personally reviewed the final submissions, her expression inscrutable. When she reached Marco's paper, however, her eyebrows rose slightly. She conferred quietly with the other judges, pointing to specific aspects of his solution. Finally, she approached the microphone. "We have our results. In 3rd place, Tanya Williams of Westridge Academy." Applause filled the room as Tanya accepted her bronze medal, grinning widely. In 2nd place, Chad Whitley of Westridge Academy. Chad's shoulders slumped slightly. After 3 consecutive first-place finishes, silver was a disappointment, but he accepted the medal graciously. And in 1st place, Dr. Chen continued, a rare smile brightening her serious features, with a truly remarkable solution to the final problem: Marco Johnson of Westridge Academy. As Marco stepped forward to receive his gold medal, Dr. Chen added something unexpected. Mr. Johnson not only solved the problem correctly but identified an elegant simplification that. She paused, seemingly choosing her words carefully, that frankly, I hadn't considered. I would be interested in discussing this approach further for possible publication. The implications of her words rippled through the audience. A Fields medalist suggesting collaboration with a high school student was extraordinary. Professor Winters was openly weeping with pride, while Dean Howard looked stunned. As photos were taken of the Westridge sweep, Chad leaned toward Marco. Well, he said with a rueful smile, I guess I can't complain about being beaten by someone who impresses a Fields medalist. Marco fingered the gold medal around his neck, still processing what had happened. He had entered the competition hoping merely to prove he belonged at Westridge. He was leaving with validation from the highest levels of the mathematical community, and the beginnings of something that felt remarkably like acceptance from his peers. As Professor Winters embraced him, whispering, I knew you could do it, Marco realized that for the first time since the incident at Eastside, he had allowed himself to shine at full brightness. And rather than punishment, he had found recognition, opportunity, and a community that valued his gift. The journey wasn't over, there would still be challenges at Westridge, still moments of doubt and prejudice to overcome. But something fundamental had shifted, both within him and in how others perceived him. He was no longer the boy who stood in the back, hiding his brilliance out of fear. He was Marco Johnson, mathematician, and finally, unapologetically himself. The Westridge Academy auditorium buzzed with excitement. 6 months had passed since the Northeastern Mathematics competition, and the school had gathered for what Dean Howard had grandly termed a celebration of academic excellence. The truth, however, was more specific, they were celebrating Marco Johnson. The published paper co-authored by Marco and Dr. Chen had sent ripples through the mathematical community. Their elegant solution to a long-standing topological problem had applications in fields ranging from quantum computing to climate modeling. More importantly for Westridge, it had brought unprecedented academic prestige to a school primarily known for its ivy-covered buildings and wealthy alumni. Marco sat in the front row, his father beside him beaming with quiet pride. Marcus Johnson had taken the day off from both jobs for this occasion, his weathered hands folded carefully over the program in his lap. Never doubted you for a minute, son, he whispered. On Marco's other side sat Dr. Thompson, invited specially from Eastside Public. The older mathematician's eyes glistened with emotion as he watched his former protege receive the recognition he had always deserved. Dean Howard approached the microphone, his previous ambivalence completely buried beneath enthusiastic support. Success, Marco had learned, could transform skeptics into champions overnight. Today, the dean announced, we not only celebrate extraordinary achievement but also institute new policies at Westridge Academy. He cleared his throat. The Board of Trustees has unanimously approved the creation of the Johnson Scholarship for Mathematical Excellence, which will provide full tuition to one exceptional student from an underserved community each year. Applause filled the auditorium. In the back row, Professor Winters smiled knowingly. She had fought hard for that scholarship in board meetings, leveraging Marco's success to create opportunities for others like him. Additionally, Dean Howard continued, we are implementing a new accommodation policy ensuring that all students receive the support they need to thrive academically, physically, and emotionally at Westridge. His gaze briefly met Marco's. We recognize that true excellence requires not conformity, but the courage to adapt our institutions to nurture exceptional gifts in all their forms. More applause, louder this time. Marco felt a tap on his shoulder and turned to find Tanya grinning at him from the row behind. Not bad for a kid who used to stand in the back of the room, she whispered. And now, Dean Howard said, I am honored to introduce our keynote speaker. In her first year at Westridge, she has transformed our mathematics department, challenging us all to rethink our assumptions about teaching and learning. Please welcome Professor Violetta Winters. Professor Winters approached the podium, her usual confidence now tempered with a humility that made her more approachable. She looked out over the audience, her gaze settling briefly on Marco before addressing the room. 6 months ago, I made the worst mistake and then the best decision of my teaching career, she began candidly. The mistake was assuming I knew what excellence looked like, that it would arrive in familiar packages and follow established patterns. The decision was admitting I was wrong. She gestured toward Marco. In Mr. Johnson, I encountered mathematical brilliance that I initially failed to recognize because it didn't conform to my expectations. His story has taught me, has taught all of us, that talent doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it stands quietly at the back of the room, waiting for someone to create the conditions where it can safely emerge. As Professor Winters continued her speech, Marco reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From the traumatic incident at Eastside to hiding his abilities at Westridge, from Professor Winters' initial dismissal to her passionate advocacy, from Chad's antagonism to their current cautious friendship, each step had been necessary to arrive at this moment of redemption. When Professor Winters concluded her remarks, she introduced a surprise guest, Ms. Porter, Marco's former teacher from Eastside. A murmur ran through the audience as a middle-aged woman approached the microphone, her steps hesitant, her expression conflicted. I am here today, Ms. Porter began, her voice barely steady, to publicly apologize to Marco Johnson. She took a deep breath. 3 years ago, I responded to his intellectual correction with physical punishment, an unforgivable breach of trust and professional ethics. My actions were born of insecurity and prejudice, and they nearly extinguished a mathematical light that the world now celebrates. Marco sat perfectly still, emotion washing over him in waves. He had never expected this moment, had never even imagined it possible. I have no right to ask for forgiveness, Ms. Porter continued, but I am compelled to acknowledge the harm I caused and to thank those who helped repair it, Dr. Thompson, who protected and nurtured Marco's gift, Professor Winters, who eventually recognized what I could not, and most of all, Marco himself, whose resilience and brilliance overcame the obstacle I placed in his path. As she stepped away from the microphone, Marco found himself standing, moved by an impulse he didn't fully understand. He approached Ms. Porter and, after a moment's hesitation, extended his hand. I forgive you, he said simply. The auditorium erupted in applause, many rising to their feet. In that moment of reconciliation, something long broken inside Marco finally began to heal. Later, as the celebration concluded, Marco found himself surrounded by a small circle of people who had shaped his journey, his father, whose sacrifices had given him opportunity, Dr. Thompson, who had recognized his talent when others couldn't, Professor Winters, who had learned to see beyond her prejudice, Tanya, who had offered friendship when he was alone, and even Chad, who had discovered that competition could coexist with respect. So, Professor Winters asked, have you decided on the university offers? Marco nodded. MIT for undergraduate, with their special research track. Dr. Chen will continue as my advisor. They're lucky to have you, Professor Winters said, genuine pride in her voice. And we're fortunate you didn't give up on Westridge. I almost did, Marco admitted. But then I realized that sometimes, standing your ground is more important than finding somewhere else to stand. As the group dispersed, Marco remained in the now empty auditorium, taking a moment to absorb everything that had happened. From the scared boy who stood at the back of the classroom to hide his pain, he had become someone who stood tall in recognition of his gifts. The journey had been difficult, but necessary. He traced his fingers over the gold medal from the competition that he still carried in his pocket, a tangible reminder that his mind was not a liability but a gift to be shared with the world. As he finally turned to leave, Marco glanced back at the podium where so many truths had been spoken today. The most important, perhaps, was the simplest: everyone deserved the chance to be seen for who they truly were, not who others assumed them to be. With that thought, he stepped forward into his future, no longer standing in the back, no longer hiding in plain sight, but moving confidently toward a horizon bright with possibility. Dear friend, stories like Marco's happen every day in classrooms across America. Brilliant minds are overlooked because of bias, prejudice, and assumptions based on appearance rather than ability. True education means creating spaces where every student can shine without fear, where differences are celebrated, not punished. It means recognizing that genius doesn't always look the way we expect it to. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Together, we can build a world where no child needs to hide their light. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that challenge perspectives and inspire change. Because understanding begins with listening to the stories we've been missing.